So downtown, a judge has yet to set a trial date for the Lubbock man accused of killing a 10-month-old child 3 years ago. Trevor Rowe remains in jail, charged with the capital murder of Marion Montoya.
Marion would have turned 4 this month. Her family is still awaiting justice. As KCBD News Channel 11's Natalie Falkenberry reports, they claim there is more blame to go around.
In 2020, Marion Montoya was just learning to walk and talk before her death at just 10 months old.
She was crammed in a backpack. She was crunched up.
Trevor Rowe, the mother's boyfriend, is charged with Marion's death.
We're just still waiting for the trial date. Supposedly it got held up because of COVID.
3 years without Marion, and still no sign of a trial or justice for her murder.
Do you call it justice or do you call it injustice? Because nothing has happened yet.
Marion's father says this is not the first time the justice system has failed their family.
The last week we had her, before she had passed, we had called because we had saw some bruises on her leg, and I called the CPS worker, and she told me she didn't have time to come out and look at her today.
Marion didn't have another day.
They didn't listen to us and didn't treat us with respect.
Now, all the family has left of Marion are her favorite stuffed animals.
She loved that elephant.
And the memories she left behind.
Wasn't afraid of anyone. You could take her somewhere, and she was just happy.
As the family waits,
A year, 2 years,
for justice to prevail, they are fighting for change.
Our goal still is to get help to do what we're going to call the Marion Montoya bill, to protect other kids that are in the same situation.
Natalie Falkenberry, KCBD News Channel 11.